Hi, thank you so much for coming to our CHI presentation. We're going to be discussing our paper, Cruising Queer HCI on the DL, a literature review of LGBTQ plus people in HCI. This was a work co-first authored by myself, Jordan Taylor, Ellen Simpson, and Anh-Ton Tran, and we had advising support from Jed Brubaker, Sarah Fox, and Haiyi. So to provide a little bit of an overview, we're going to provide some background on Queer HCI. We're going to go into our methodology, talk about some brief initial chronological findings. Then we're going to describe what we found about how queer people are discussed within the broader HCI community as a whole, and within research specifically about queer people. And then we're going to go on to a brief discussion. So transitioning over to our background, we wanted to begin with a note on our choice of language. So for the sake of brevity in this presentation, we're going to be using queer and LGBTQ plus interchangeably. However, we recognize that not all LGBTQ plus people necessarily identify with the word queer, nor do all queer people have the same experiences. In fact, one of the motivations for our work was to draw out these differences. Also, as we'll discuss, language can change over time. We try to take this seriously throughout our study. So Queer HCI is a subfield within the broader HCI community that kind of has two pillars, research about queer people and research that involves queer theory, as has been articulated in the three prior Queer HCI special interest groups. In this particular literature review, we're concerned with research on queer people. However, research on queer theory is an important area for future work. And specifically, our three research questions are one, how have LGBTQ plus people been researched in HCI? So this is particularly oriented toward research focused on queer people. Then two, we're also interested in how LGBTQ plus people have been discussed broadly in HCI. So research on queer people is, of course, part of HCI, but that research is obviously shaped by broader discourses within our discipline. As well, we're also interested in kind of the temporal nature of how the discussion of queer people may have changed over time. So with that in mind, Ellen is now going to tell you a little bit more about our methodology.
Thank you, Jordan. So yes, as I'm here to talk a little bit about methods, which we have broken down into kind of three stages. The first was how we picked our corpus, the second was how we organized the data, and the third was how we analyzed it. So to begin with corpus selection, we constructed an initial search query based on our lived experiences. We sat together and we came up with a list of words and alternative terms for LGBTQ plus people, gender identities, sexualities. Some of these terms ranged from like bisexual to sexual minority women, all of which are terms that, we searched within the ACMDL. During this time period, we also selected the venues that we wanted to examine within HCI, and these were based mostly on the results that we found, as well as like these were the top HCI venues that we encountered. From this, then we kind of assembled and assessed these records for eligibility. So here we were looking at, okay, what papers are potentially talking about non-binary math, or potentially somebody's name is Gail, so they will show up in a search for gay. We also identified a few papers using queer theory, but weren't about queer people. There were some very notable and very fun papers within this corpus, such as papers that were about anything from queering a computer mouse by sticking it in your underwear. Really great paper, unfortunately not a part of this corpus. And ultimately, our corpus then included about 1,021 papers, and these papers were largely from CHI and CSCW with smaller contributions from both DIS and TOCHI. Next, in order to organize our data, we initially went into it thinking we could do a binary sort of this paper is about queer people, this paper is not about queer people. And what we ultimately found was there was about a range of four. So we had like papers that were exclusively about only queer populations, talking about queer people living their best queer lives, all the way down to some studies that said, oh, we had one non-binary participant in this study. Both of these papers discuss queer people. They discuss queer people in very different ways. So what we decided to do was take research that was exclusively about queer people and significantly about queer people and group those as like queer HCI papers. And that's the smaller part of this corpus, but it's the part that we gave that formed our queer HCI understanding. Secondly, we also then grouped like the papers that framed queer identity in some way or briefly mentioned queer people as a member of a research cohort. This is the majority of our corpus, and these are what we would consider to be the overall HCI papers that discuss queer people. Finally, in our data analysis, in our overall HCI corpus, we identified trends based on memos, open codes, and meeting notes during our data annotation period. And this also kind of emerged from an ongoing discussion of themes throughout our months-long coding process. For the queer HCI corpus, we used affinity diagramming to identify genres of queer HCI research. And here we borrowed DeSalvo and colleagues' definition of genres as common frameworks that structure how researchers define the problem and structure what is the appropriate solution. Suffices to say, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive categories, but they are genres that tell a story of queer HCI research. And so diving into the first section of this, our findings to address research question 3, how has research about queer people kind of emerged over time? We wanted to highlight some chronological findings. The first is that the first mention of queer people within our corpus is in Muller and colleagues' 1997 paper, where they are discussing how queer people, among other communities, may have different concerns and prioritizations around visibility. Next, in 1998 at CHI, Williamson and colleagues put together a panel where one of the people on the panel was the director of the Intersex Society of North America. This is the first paper that significantly involves queer people, as one of the members of this panel was a person who fell as a queer identity. And then subsequently, the first papers exclusively about queer people took 16 years from that 1998 paper to emerge. And these are papers on queer sexual health and queer youth, and how they kind of function within online communities. And these were published at CHI and CSCW in 2014. And so we put together a timeline of what queer HCI looks like in terms of firsts. Queer HCI is a relatively new subfield in HCI, and the ACM SIGCHI was founded in 1982, but there's no mention of queer people until 1997 when Muller and colleagues put out that first paper. And there is no paper that exclusively is about queer people until 2014. And another thing that kind of emerged from the study is that some queer communities remain very understudied. So there were no papers on bi or lesbian women that were published until 2022. We got a little bit more on this later, but I'm going to turn it back over to Jordan to talk about how HCI discusses queer people.
Thanks, Ellen. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how HCI discusses queer people as a whole. So this is discussing those papers that either briefly mention queer people or frame queer people in a particular way, but queer people are not significantly or exclusively this topic being researched. So within that, we identified 4 trends. This includes shifting understandings of gender over time. This is, for instance, increasing recognition of non-binary people outside the male-female binary in gender surveys and things like that. Increasingly, luckily in recent years, it has been in decline, but in the late 2000s and early 2010s, there were a number of papers that framed queerness as political. They're bad in some way. We saw some research framings that we deemed to be homophobic. There is in recent years, as there's a turn towards social justice in HCI, an increasing recognition of queer marginalization. And the one trend that I'm going to go into in greater detail is that queer people are increasingly being discussed as a limitation or area for future work. This is likely because queer people are increasingly being recognized as a marginalized group. This is quite a recent trend. So before 2017, only 2 papers mentioned that their work may not apply to LGBTQ plus people. This is not because their research applied to queer people in the past, but likely because queer people weren't thought about. We also noticed that this comes up in particular common situations. For instance, research that's particularly focused on women rarely focuses on queer and trans experiences. This includes research on, for instance, menstruation, intimate partner violence, makeup. Surveys sometimes struggle to figure out how to deal with LGBTQ plus people, especially small sample sizes, research on couples, dating, things like that. So overall, kind of in summary, researchers in HCI are increasingly trying their best, but there are a number of pitfalls still on how people are operationalizing their allyship. For a little bit more information on this, please take a look at our paper. So now I'm going to shift and talk a little bit about genres of queer-focused HCI research. This is research either exclusively or substantially about queer people. So we noticed that we identified 5 genres, 4 of which focus on particular aspects of queer identity that are particularly useful to HCI researchers. So this is queer people as political subjects, which is useful to those interested in, for instance, online social movements, queer people falling outside the norm. This is useful for those interested in interrogating or normative assumptions about the users or ways in which classification systems may break down. There's research that focuses on queer people as highly stigmatized subjects. This kind of hinges on coming out and is common in privacy and online identity management research. Some focuses on queer people as highly vulnerable. And there's a smaller but burgeoning community of research that is more community centered. So I'm now going to, for the sake of brevity, only go into one of these and talk about queer people as a stigmatized subject. So the HCI community as a whole has a long interest in issues of privacy and disclosure within both privacy and social computing research. And we see that queer people are particularly useful subjects for those interested in understanding these topics, as can be seen by research on the privacy concerns of marginalized groups in our corpus, as well as a substantial body of literature understanding visibility and identity management for queer people, trans people, queer men, hijra, etc. So with that in mind, I'm going to now talk a little bit about the more community-centered research. So this includes research on knowledge construction, the ways in which people use technology to understand the world, research employing participatory methodologies, as well as those studying queer community building practices. So with that in mind, we're now going to shift and talk a little bit more about a discussion that Ellen is going to start off.
All right, so our discussion is structured around some kind of implications for overall HCI and some provocations for queer HCI. I'm going to start with the provocations. So there's very little HCI research on specific queer populations, so we really encourage queer HCI researchers to be more specific. There are many papers on trans and LGBTQ plus people broadly, but there's very few papers on particular subcommunities such as bisexual or lesbians, and intersections such as aging or rural people who live in rural populations. So we encourage queer HCI researchers to really reckon with the differences and commonalities of LGBTQ plus and queer, which also do include troubling these two categories. Coupled with this, we ask the question, must our research always be about trauma? Beyond centering stigma and suffering, we encourage research beyond centering stigma and suffering for being queer, which is a valid experience, but it is not the only thing that defines queer people. We really call for a need for joy, research on joy, fun, and the everyday. And finally, we want to ask a question of why are we studying queer people? Are queer people a means to HCINs, such as coming out being a useful conceit for privacy research? Or are queer people really ends onto themselves? For example, that like burgeoning body of community-centered research that we observed. So this is like a really big important question that we want and encourage queer HCI researchers to think about. And so Jordan is going to talk about some implications for broader HCI.
Thank you, Ellen. So going into some of these implications, first of all, we noticed some researchers struggling with how to report or participant gender, and we really encourage researchers to engage in prior queer HCI research that has tried to provide some guidelines on how to go about this. However, there are no strict rules that we can come up with. We also encourage researchers to consider the limitations of limitation sections. Limitations are not simply a get out of jail free card. We must not simply relegate queer people to future work that never comes. We also encourage people to consider the limitations of marginalization is the dominant lens through which we understand queer as well as other social groups in HCI. So with that in mind, we want to call out some limitations. Those stem from our positionalities, our methodology of analyzing texts, as well as potential survivorship bias. For instance, we can't understand what was published or what was not published or what one couldn't or believed they couldn't say. So with that in mind, I wanted to thank you so much for watching our video and particularly shout out our research help from Kelly, Ashley, Harkiran, and Shreya. Thank you so much.